Colleague Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, said he'd give you 7 out of 10. What would you give yourselves as a government?
I think I'd be inclined to agree with Johnny. I think that's about right. I think we have made enormous strides forward in a lot of areas. Of course, there's more to do. And of course, we hear what voters are telling us, that they voted for change, they're impatient for change, they want to see it and feel it in their communities.
Marley, would you give Labour 7 out of 10, more or less, over the last year?
Well, I think it's good to see politicians being upfront and frank and actually giving a number out of 10, which I haven't seen before. I think that's a reasonable assessment for them to make. Clearly, there have been big investments, big down payments in the future. Huge, big capital spending and
of our money, of taxes, which are almost certainly going to have to rise.
Absolutely, which I think is part of the government's overall industrial strategy and will provide support for the future. But as we saw in the US with Biden, you have these big investments. It doesn't necessarily translate into a political victory in the short term, because it takes time for these investments to pay off. So I think the challenge for the government now, moving into the next year, is how do you actually deal with the current issues the public are facing? Cost of living crisis, challenges.
Surely
in
that was
NHS.
The point in the last year, Marley.
Well, clearly, the government was responding to huge fundamental challenges, both with the government finances, with public services.
So at what point do you then say, right, we've now got to hold Labour responsible for the state of the country? Because a year seems to me to be a fairly reasonable period of time.
Yeah, and clearly there needs to be much more to do. And I think one of the things that's been missing from this first year, which has been largely focused on managing some of the challenges that was laid to them by the previous government, is now about setting out a clear argument and vision for the future. And that's going to be essential for them to get back on the front foot for the next few years.